All right, everybody, welcome back to Introduction to U.S. Multicultural Literatures. This will be the second to last lecture in the class. Today we will be we'll be doing a couple things. As I mentioned in the last lecture, we're coming toward the present or considering the present in light of the topics of this course. And so the last couple lectures will be a bit of a mix of different things. But the basic idea of today's lecture will be to introduce our final novel. It's a very short novel called Faces in the Crowd by Valeria Luiselli. And I want to introduce sort of all of the topics that I think are relevant to this book and the issues it raises that we've maybe touched on in the course before but haven't quite discussed explicitly. And those are issues of language, translation, and world literature, the way in which a multicultural ideal disrupts the idea of a national literature, calls into question the idea of a national literature. I also want to talk about the idea that perhaps we're moving into a neo-modernist form of culture in the early 21st century, that I think a lot of the developments of 21st century literature have been attempts to go beyond postmodernism and to go beyond as well postmodern ideas of multiculturalism, and to try to arrive at newer ideas that in some ways, while they are new, like all things that are new, it draws upon the past. And I think what's being drawn upon is modernism, is some of the ideals of modernism that postmodernism critiqued, and yet I think never fully dispelled. And there's I think, an idea in the early 21st century, particularly in literature, that some of the ideals of modernism could stand to be recovered, and that some of the ideals of postmodernism have perhaps run their course, have become attenuated, have become not as sharp as they once were. Because I think that's what happens in culture and the arts. There are cycles, that some ideas, they come up, they're very new, they're very transgressive, they're very subversive. But then, as they become more and more accepted, especially accepted by academic institutions, political institutions, they come to seem like they're just part of some establishment. They once were subversive, but now they're hegemonic. Now they're the norm, and thus what arises to displace them are ideas that seem freshly subversive. And yet, ironically, the freshly subversive usually draws upon something that preceded the new hegemony it's critiquing. I hope that makes sense. There are cultural cycles. I think if you look at anything, look at fashion, look at popular music, you can see these cycles happening. And they happen in literature. I would even argue they happen in politics. And I think that we're in a moment where subverting the formerly subversive postmodern gesture is of interest to younger artists, younger writers, younger intellectuals, people on the scene. And so that, I never discussed my image. I usually introduce our units, our chapters, with an image drawn from the visual arts, whether architecture or painting, and in this case it's photography. And I found this image, I think, when I first started teaching this class a couple years ago, I think is when I found this image. I don't remember what I Googled to find this image. It might have been Neo-modernism itself, which is a term that I just sort of am using. I don't know if it's a very established term. But I found this picture, and I found it on the website of a photographer named Dylan Hollingsworth. And I thought it was really interesting because I went to the photographer's website, and he does two forms of photography mainly. One form of photography he practices is kind of a straight journalistic form of photography. He just goes, photographs, events as they're happening, and I think he sells them to newspapers or magazines or websites, as well as exhibiting them as an artist. And his main interest over the last decade has been photographing the political movements, such as Occupy Wall Street from the first part of the last decade, and then Black Lives Matter more recently. And I think that's interesting because I think of Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter as, in certain ways, neo-modern political movements. And what I mean by that is, if postmodernism tended to be about what one theorist of postmodernism, Michel Foucault, called a micropolitics, a politics that was kind of radically dispersed, radically localized, radically interested in defending certain forms of life and ways of life that were, from the point of view of vast administrative power structures, rather niche. I think that Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter draw on more modern forms of protest. They make more universal claims to challenge capitalism. In the case of Occupy Wall Street, capitalism as a global form of government, as a global form of economics. And in the case of Black Lives Matter, the idea of Black lives as also a global, diasporic political formation, and a challenge to white supremacy as a global formation. And so you don't have so much the postmodern micropolitics, the micro movements in various locales defending a local way of life, but you have movements making much broader, more universal, more progressive, in the sense of, picking a side within history that you want to move with, political claims. And so I think that is neo-modernism, I think, at the level of the political. So that's one aspect of Dylan Hollingsworth's artistic practice, is photographing these mass movements. But he also does art photography, that is photography that is not journalistic, that is not trying to record something that's really happening, but he uses photography to create sometimes quite fantastical images. And that's one of his art photographs, is what I chose here, and why I think it indicates neo-modernism, if it's not ridiculous that I'm trying to force this term, that I'm one of the only people who uses it, but whatever. You signed up for the class, so you have to listen to what I say. You don't have to. You could turn this off right now. But anyway, I might even recommend it. But anyway, the neo-modernist thing about this photograph that interests me is what's in the photograph is you have a person who's chained down, and yet this person is trying to reach this ladder that ascends straight up to the sky. It doesn't even, the top of the ladder isn't shown. It could be going all the way up to outer space or to heaven or whatever. And what interests me about this image is I feel like postmodernism posited that we as human beings are completely caught up in, and not only caught up in, almost entirely constructed by the discourses we live in. We live in a world of signs, of language, of images, and that world makes us who we are. And you can maybe alert yourself and your fellow human beings to that through gestures like metafiction, to say, hey, remember, everything's a fiction, but you can't do much beside that. You can't do much other than to just sort of recognize, whether with a laugh or with a kind of sigh, that you are constrained radically by the images, the discourses, the language, the culture that surrounds you. That's your only real freedom, is to recognize your unfreedom in postmodernism. And modernism, by contrast, in the arts, you'll remember, whether it was Picasso, whether it was Nella Larson, modernists thought they were getting to some truth about desire, as in Gertrude Stein, about the progressive history of people of color, as in Langston Hughes, or maybe more subjectively about human psychology, as in the incredibly incisive portrayal of psychology you get in Nella Larson. The modernists, I think, understood some of what the postmodernists were saying about how we are sort of trapped within culture, but they also thought that art, and I think that politics, could transcend that, could rise above that and get to a truth, some point of truth. Whereas postmodernism cautions against that idea of a transcendent truth. The only truth it countenances is that there's no transcendence. And so this image to me is neo-modernist because it shows a person chained down, caught, trapped, as postmodernism says we are, and yet striving to ascend, striving to reach this ladder that would carry us upward from the things in which we're caught. And I think that liberationist view, whether you take that in a more direct political way, as say Langston Hughes might, or maybe just in a what's being liberated is simply some truth about humanity, as we might see in Nella Larson. I think that's a kind of modernist impulse, this striving for some point of transcendence, and striving even in the things that bind us. So that's why I chose this image. That's why I think this is an interesting image from a photographer who I think is immersed in what I would think of as a neo-modern form of politics. So just as a brief review, we also looked in our last lecture at some artistic and political attempts to break out of postmodernism with things like the new sincerity and metamodernism, literary and artistic attempts to try to cut through a little bit of the tangle of language that postmodernism suggests we are trapped in, and try to make more direct appeals to emotions or to truth. So that happens in the arts. We talked about some of the debates that have been happening on the left in the last 20 years, especially the last 10 years, about multiculturalism. And we saw writers and theorists and thinkers who were broadly sympathetic, of course, to the idea of diversity, of plurality, of overcoming oppression, of marginalized and oppressed groups overcoming that oppression, and yet saying that the multiculturalist, especially in its postmodernist guise ideal, wasn't that good at doing that because it was too kind of relativist, it was too easily captured by prevailing forces in society that just put a kind of diverse face on what were still highly inequitable, and not just in terms of class, but indeed still in terms of race, highly inequitable economic practices and political practices. And we saw the claim that it could be a bit excessively constraining to the artist, and we've seen that as far back as the novel of our postmodernist unit was The Ghostwriter by Philip Roth, which was a novel that was already worrying about that idea that if you sort of level out human society into different groups that are seen as equal, but equally, equally, how can I put it? They're equally valid, but the validity is just that everybody's claims are valid and there's no real truth claims, and then the artist is just the spokesperson for each of those groups, and not a truth teller. So there's a worry that there's a constraint upon the artist. So we talked about these debates that have been happening within groups that are sympathetic to the broadest ideals of multiculturalism, but worry about the practice. And these, of course, are controversial ideas. I leave it to you. I don't make political claims in this class. This isn't a class about my opinion. I'm just trying to introduce you to the arguments. So that's where we were, and then we looked at Marilyn Chin's excellent poem, How I Got That Name, as a kind of summa, a summation of where we've been with poetry, and a poem that in its capaciousness, in its multitudinousness, I think is so aware of these issues and the pitfalls on all sides of them. So that's where we were. Now I want to talk about what I mean by neo-modernism in terms of literature. And so I want to talk about that. Then I want to talk about world literature, because I think ideas about world literature and translation are very important to understanding Valeria Luiselli's novel. And then I just want to introduce the novel a little bit more by talking about Luiselli herself. And then in my next lecture, I will talk about the text of the novel. I think it's a difficult novel to discuss if you haven't read the whole thing. You sort of have to have the whole thing in your head to sort of apprehend its whole structure, to really see what she's doing at every moment. So I'm not going to talk about the text in this lecture. I'm just going to approach the text. So, I just have my little slide from our first lecture, slideception, you might say. I have my modernism characteristics over on the right. So we have a rejection of formal literary traditions like plot and fiction, meter and rhyme and poetry. We have a rejection of the idea that the artist is a moral teacher who is sort of giving you some moral lesson. The artist instead just kind of presents life and leads you to interpret it. There's a deep interest in psychology, particularly the irrational, and we saw that in stream of consciousness narration, which Nella Larson sometimes practiced. And Nella Larson was highly interested in the irrational psychology of Helga Crane, the way that Helga Crane would act and respond to things in an unconscious way. And we also saw an interest in, for instance, the unconscious, the pre-rational movements of sexual desire in Gertrude Stein. We also saw a belief in the importance of a multiplicity of human perspectives incorporated into one work of art. I think that we probably saw that more in the visual art more than in any one work of literature we read. In Picasso's Cubism, the way he incorporates into the work literally multiple visual perspectives, so that you'll see a body and you're looking at part of the body straight on and another part of the body in profile. And we have an interest in non-Western cultures, a belief that so modernism was interesting because it's not relativist. It doesn't so much say that all cultures are equal in the way that I think the postmodern gesture says that all cultures are equal, but none have access to a transcendent truth. They're sort of truths relative to each culture. I think modernism more took the view that there are truths that we can access, but you have to get rid of this 19th century European imperialist white supremacist idea that only Europe has the truth, that there is truth to be found in non-Western cultures, in capital T, truth. So it's not a relativist idea, it's an idea that different cultures have given access to the truth. And then similarly, we have that belief in culture as the best that has been thought and said. That so modernism kind of reforms that idea to make it more plural, to say that other cultures have the best that has been thought and said as well. Though actually the guy that originally came up with that, Matthew Arnold, I think also believed that, but he's sometimes stereotyped as more stodgy than he was. But the best that has been thought and said is an idea that can encompass all of world cultures. So those were the characteristics of modernism. When I say that we're entering, I think, a neo-modernist period, what I mean is I think 21st century American and world literature has seen a return, first of all, just at the level of genre. And I'm talking really about fiction here, to modernist genres and themes, such as the psychological novel, the autobiographical novel, the plotless novel of alienation, and surreal motifs. And I think you see that. I think the most prevalent trend in 21st century fiction so far, or particularly of the last decade, has been something called autofiction. And autofiction, it's just what it sounds like. It's a new form of autobiographical fiction, usually highly plotless, where it's just the author kind of writing about their life. And I think that's very much a throwback to genres that were dominant in modernism. Looking again at Quicksand as our example, that was a very autobiographical novel. I didn't really dwell on that aspect of it, but it was. I mean, most of what happened in that book, except the end, I think happened in some ways to Helga Crane, or to Nella Larson, that is, but confusing the author and the character is what autobiographical fiction is. And that was a fairly plotless novel. There wasn't like a very well I don't mean well. I'm not insulting it. It's not that it's not well constructed. It's just that it's not constructed to be a plot that is based on some like suspenseful revelation of mystery or something. It's constructed to be a plot that sort of follows this person's life, and it doesn't always feel like it's heavily plotted because the course of a life is somewhat random and it's more organized by theme and by motif than by an overbearing plot structure. And I think we see a return to these psychological, autobiographical, relatively plotless novels in particularly the last decade. Whereas I think what predominated at the end of the 20th century were novels like Antelope Woman, which was, I think, heavily plotted. We have this family saga unfolding, and you have to very much keep track of the plot of the genealogy of the family. And it's not autobiographical. I mean, autobiography is in a way the apex of realism, because if realism treats everyday common life, autobiographical fiction treats a real person's everyday common life. Whereas what was dominant, I think, at the end of the 20th century in writers like Louise Erdrich, or some writers we didn't read in this course like Toni Morrison or Leslie Marmon Silko, was magical realism. Not only wasn't it autobiographical, but it had heavy infusions of the fantastical. So I think this neo-modernism is a throwback to modernist genres in fiction. I also think, and we talked about this in our last lecture, a renewed interest in the possibility of transcending language or culture in the relativistic sense to reach something universal. I think in fiction that's often been the body. There's been a big interest in the body in fiction, in theory, and nonfiction over the last 10, 20 years, that the one thing we all share is this kind of physical substrate. And so that can be a universal force, the body. But also emotion, affect, and what I was talking about as a more universalist form of politics. There's been a much renewed interest, for instance, in Marxism, in socialism, which the postmodernists often heavily criticized. Think about Jean-Francois Lyotard and other French theorists who were sometimes in America called Marxists, but really they were heavy critics of it. They said this is a terribly oppressively universalist ideology. It says there's one way to human equality. And so postmodernists, again, said let's focus on micro-politics, on what each particular group needs and wants and can achieve in a very particular setting. And I think there's been a return to a more universal form of politics in that sense. And then still, though, what makes it neo-modernism and not just a kind of total revival of modernism is that you can't abandon the lessons of postmodernism, especially about the lessons of trying to avoid the imposition of a single culture. That the imposition of a single culture on the world is, I think, still considered something you'd very much want to avoid. You have to recognize the plurality of cultures, even if you think that there can be some ways of saying this or that in any one culture is true or good, and this or that is false or bad. You still want to recognize the legitimacy of the plurality of cultures. So that's what I mean by neo-modernism, and I hope that made sense. So I think that Louis Selly's Faces in the Crowd is very much a neo-modernist novel. Much of it, well, precisely half of it, is a plotless, psychological, autobiographical novel. The other half is neo-modernist in a very literal way. It's about a modernist poet in New York meeting modernists, meeting writers that we've met in this course as characters. Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, Nella Larson are all in the work. One of the reasons I chose it as our last work is it takes its title from the first poem we discussed in this class, which was Ezra Pound's In a Station of the Metro. Faces in the Crowd is a phrase from In the Stations of the Metro. Ezra Pound briefly kind of appears in the novel as a character, and someone else who appears in the novel as a character is Nella Larson, author of the first novel we read in the course, Quicksand. So Faces in the Crowd brings us back full circle as the early 21st century in many ways mirrors the early 20th century. However, To discuss faces in the crowd, we also have to discuss some new topics, some topics we have not yet really fully broached in this class. Maybe we've alluded to them, especially when we talked about the martyrs. We talked about is this a, how do we talk about national literature in relation to this novel? Is this a Korean novel? Is it an American novel? Well, in many ways, you'd have to say it was both. I think that Faces in the Crowd raises exactly the same question. Is this an American novel? Is this a Mexican novel? I think in many ways you'd have to say both. But I would also ask you to remember that almost every novel we've read in this course, every novel actually we've read in this course, has had an international dimension. Helga Crane was African American, but also Danish American. She spends part of the novel in Denmark, so part of the novel is set in Europe. Obviously, in The Martyred, we have a novel written in English by a writer who becomes an American citizen, but he was born in Korea. His first language is Korean. The entire novel is set in Korea, so we have a novel that sort of straddles the United States and Korea. In The Ghostwriter, that's written in English by a writer who's an American, and yet the literary allegiance in that novel is to the global Jewish diaspora. And so we have many references to writers who wrote in German or in Dutch or in Hebrew, who are examples of a Jewish tradition that spans the globe, that encompasses Europe, that encompasses Israel. And so that novel has an international dimension. In Antelope Woman, we have a novel that also was multilingual, that was, we got a large quantity of Ojibwe, and I would say that novel was international in a sense in which it was concerning Native American sovereignty. It was concerning the limitations of the sovereignty of the U.S. government over Native American territory. It was a novel that lamented the liquidation of the tribal land titles of the different Native American nations during the end of the 19th century with the Dawes Act. It was a novel, I think, whose utopian horizon, and in many ways, is a North American continent that would be international, in which there would be the United States maybe, but there would also be a United States that did not have sovereignty over Ojibwe territory or over other Native American territory. It sort of saw Native American territory as nations in their own right. And finally, we come to Faces in the Crowd, which, as I'll explain, has an international dimension between Europe, or between the United States and Mexico, with also some European elements as well. So that means, I think, now we have to confront this idea of world literature. I know this is a class on U.S. literature, on American literature, but I think I've demonstrated sufficiently that multiculturalism makes the idea of a single national literature hard to fully endorse. So we have to discuss world literature, and we have to discuss translation, because if you're going between national literatures, if you're going between cultures, you're often going between languages. So let's talk now about world literature. So every discussion about world literature begins the same way. It begins with two quotations. Every discussion of world literature begins with two quotations. So I'm going to share with you those two quotations and interpret them a little bit and tell you what I think world literature means as the basis of these two quotations, because there were two uses of this term, and both of these quotations were originally in German, which I think is interesting in itself, because Germany in the 18th and 19th century would have been considered a fairly peripheral European power, a country that had nothing like the centrality of Britain or France. And so this idea of a literature that was international and in ways that would benefit countries and cultures that were not considered central, I think it's fitting that that comes from a peripheral European country at the time. So the phrase was Weltliteratur, world literature. So the quotations are from two people. They're two people who we've already heard of in this course, very influential German 19th century writers. Goethe, we heard of Goethe, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. We heard of him in Anthony Hecht's ironic citation of his last words, more light, as Hecht saying that the ideal of world culture for which Goethe stood was destroyed in the Holocaust. And the second quotation is from Karl Marx. We have to again confront Marxism in this course, as we have, because whether you're for it or against it, and as we've seen, whether you were for or against Marxism was in many ways the central dividing line in the 20th century. You have to acknowledge that its way of thinking about things was very crucial to defining world politics in the 20th century, and perhaps again. So let's begin. Let's begin with these two quotes. So Goethe, I take my quotation from a book from 2003 by David Damrosch called "What is World Literature?" Very beginning of the book, he begins with the quote from Goethe, and then I think he does the quote from Marx just a couple pages later. So what's the quote from Goethe? "I am more and more convinced," Goethe remarked, "that poetry is the universal possession of mankind, revealing itself everywhere and at all times in hundreds and hundreds of men. I therefore like to look about me in foreign nations and advise everyone to do the same. National literature is now a rather unmeaning term. The epoch of world literature is at hand, and everyone must strive to hasten its approach." And he says this in 1827. So in 1827, we have a German author, Goethe, saying that national literatures are basically over. Poetry is the universal possession of everyone. He says mankind and men, but I don't think he actually meant that in a gender-exclusive way. He says it's the property of everyone. Everyone can write great poetry. Everyone can write great literature. And so if you want to know what great literature is, you must read the literature of foreign nations. And this isn't evident in the quote, but I can tell you that when he said that, he didn't just mean England and France. He meant he was reading works in translation from the Persian, from the Chinese, from the Hindi. He was reading Chinese novels. He was reading Persian poets like Hafez. He was reading, Indian dramas like Sakuntala. Goethe meant this in a way that went beyond Europe in 1827. So he meant this in a way that I would say was genuinely incipiently multiculturalist. So he says that the era of national literature is at an end. Poetry is the universal possession of mankind. So it's a universalist idea, but for him it's an aesthetic idea. For him, we've now understood that the ability to create great art is universal. So if you want to experience great art, you must experience the art of multiple nations. Now the next big quote again is from Marx. Well, Marx and Engels, his writing buddy, and the guy that paid his bills. So look into the biography. It's very interesting. So Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the founders of Marxism, they write the Communist Manifesto about 20 years after Goethe says this, and they I think knew he said this. They were familiar with his idea there of Weltliteratur, of world literature. So they also make a famous statement in the Communist Manifesto about world literature, and this is always the second quotation that is brought up when talking about world literature. Now, the Communist Manifesto, it's a short little document that is, like all manifestos, it gives their program, their political ideas. It's the work that lays out their main principles as communists. And the interesting thing about the Communist Manifesto, I don't know how many people have read it, but what might surprise you, what surprised me when I first read it when I was in college, is that you probably, if you haven't read it, you still know that Marx and Engels opposed capitalism and that communism is an anti-capitalist ideology. So what's very surprising when you take up the Communist Manifesto to read it, and it's like a 30-page document, you could read it in an afternoon, is the first 5 pages or so. I might be slightly exaggerating for effect, but the beginning of the Communist Manifesto says everything nice anybody might ever have had to say about capitalism. Because it's important to understand that for Marx, history was progressive. And so capitalism was an improvement on the thing that went before, broadly speaking, feudalism. In feudalism, it was largely an agrarian society, and the dominant economic people. There is a very small layer of an aristocracy that controlled all the land, and everybody else had to work the land. And so capitalism genuinely liberated a lot of people by moving from an agrarian to an industrial and from a rural to an urban society, and thus capitalism could really be praised for its progressive tendencies, for all of the stultifying aspects of medieval culture that it swept away. So Marx, it's very important to Marx that we don't go back. We have to go forward. And he thinks that the next advance will be communism, but that capitalism was a genuine advance on what went before. And so that's when he raises this, him and Engels. I don't know why I keep giving all the credit to Marx. I think Marx was the more sophisticated theorist of the two. But anyway, Marx says in his recitation of the good things done by capitalism, this is when he brings up world literature. So let's read through this quotation. The bourgeoisie, so the bourgeoisie is the ruling class of capitalism. They're the people who own the means of industrial production. The people who own the factories, the people who own the industrial world. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. To the great chagrin of reactionists, that just means conservatives, it has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations, by industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones. Industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. In place of the old wants satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. And as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. So Marx is paying a heavy compliment to capitalism here. He's saying, here's what it does. In the old days, you would eat what was grown in your own country, and you would wear clothes made from material grown in your own country, and you would read literature from authors writing in your own language in your own country. What happens under capitalism is we have the beginning of not only global trade, because there was always global trade, actually. I exaggerated what I just said. There was always global trade. But there was global production. So a guy, and it would have been a guy back then, in England, owned a company that took material from India and brought it to England and made clothes out of it and sold them. Somebody owned a company that got coffee from the Middle East and sold it in England. And somebody owned a company that was a publishing company that was publishing works written in China and translating them into English, and you could read them in England. And so capitalism introduces global production and consumption. It's no longer is it true that most of what you eat wear, read, watch, drink, comes entirely from your own country. Capitalism destroyed that, it melted that away. And so now we have global trade, global production, global consumption, and that introduces world literature. It's now very common, and he's writing in the middle of the 19th century. It's very common in the 19th century for a German person like Goethe to read poems originally written in Persian, novels originally written in Chinese, as he's drinking coffee, that were beans originally grown in some other country. So that's what Marx means. However, as Marx would have been the first to tell us, with this comes certain inequalities. So the owners are mostly in Europe, and they're exploiting the world market that is mostly outside of Europe. They're exploiting, often through direct imperialism. So, you have the British controlling India as English companies are exploiting India as a source of raw material, a source of labor, and then the better off people in India as also a consumer market for goods that they sell back to them. But still, there's an unequal relation. This is the era of imperialism and of the European empires. So what can sound appealingly universal, oh, everybody's reading and drinking and eating and wearing stuff from everywhere else, conceals what's actually much more of a one-way exploitative relationship. And the legacy of that imperialism, even though the European empires don't exist in the same way, there's no more direct control of England over India or Ireland, or of France over Algeria or Vietnam, you nevertheless have the legacy of this imperialism, which has led to a continued national inequality that tends to privilege the global north, Europe and the United States, over Latin America, Asia, Africa. And that was a big issue, as we saw in the middle of the 20th century when we were reading The Martyr. And this also has structured concerns about world literature. And this brings me to a final quotation I want to introduce. So, in the late 20th century, or the second half of the 20th century, with the development of academic theories focused on post-colonialism or anti-colonialism or decolonialism, of how to remove these vestiges of material and cultural inequality that stemmed from European imperialism, there was a lot of concern about inequalities in world literature. How do these inequalities work? Well, the main global publishing companies are controlled from Europe and the United States. And so what gets translated from, let's say, from Chinese or from Arabic or from Urdu, what gets translated into European languages like French or English depends on what those European and American publishers think they can sell to their own audience. And so you take the diversity of publishing that might exist in China or Nigeria or India, and those companies translate into English, or even if it's originally written in English, as countries in there's plenty of countries in Africa or in Asia that have English language markets, but their works they're published in a local context. You translate or you publish in Europe and the United States only part of that diversity, and only the part that you think an American audience will understand or be interested in. And this has led, some critics argued, to a kind of homogenization of world literature, that what makes it to the world market from local markets is a very distorted image of the world, shaped by the perceived tastes and values of European and American consumers. So that leads to a cultural homogenization. So let's say a work is published in another country, let's just again say China for the sake of argument, and it depends heavily on local references. It depends heavily on references to Chinese culture, Chinese history, and European and American publishers think, well, our readers won't understand that. We're not going to publish that work. We're going to publish a work that seems more universal, quote unquote. And why does it seem more universal? Because it depends less on these local cultural references. And so doesn't the universal just become a synonym for what Americans and Europeans already care about? Similarly, and we saw this very decisively with Richard Kim's career, there's a political homogenization. America and Europe is generally, particularly at the mid-century, were very wary, for instance, of leftism. And so they would publish works, they would be more concerned to publish world works by writers who were anti-communist, to the point where there was CIA funding for initiatives to have anti-communist Latin American, Asian, African writers published in the United States. So these are the concerns about the inequalities of world literature that it creates. In my quotation, look at the words in italics, cultural homogenization and political homogenization. Now, I chose this quotation. I'm not actually going to read it to you. You could read it yourself. But it's from an article that I take to be very exemplary of some more recent trends. The article is by Rebecca N. Wolkowitz, and it's about a British writer of Japanese descent named Kazuo Ishiguro, who's one of the big world writers right now. He won the Nobel Prize in 2017. I highly recommend his novels, particularly Never Let Me Go, which is a kind of strange, depressing in a good way, science fiction novel. He's wonderful, Kazuo Ishiguro. But she writes this article about Ishiguro, and one of the notable things about him is that he says, and he's coming from a multicultural and bilingual background. His parents came to Japan, or he came to Japan when he was 5 years old, or his family came to England from Japan. So he was raised in a Japanese speaking household in England, and so he comes from a bilingual and multicultural background, and some of his works are set in Japan and are about Japanese culture. Others of his works are set in England and are about English culture. And he has said that he very self-consciously writes knowing that his work will be translated. So he says he doesn't depend on very local references, and he writes in a style that is easily translated. So he doesn't use a lot of wordplay, he doesn't use a lot of poetic devices, he doesn't use a lot of idioms. He tries to write in a style that's almost pre-translatable. And this leads Rebecca N. Wolkowitz to say that, well, yes, we could worry about political and cultural homogenization. Isn't it also a good thing to try to be universal? Shouldn't we praise Ishiguro for writing already for a global audience? And I think this essay is really interesting. It's published in 2007. I think it's a good example of what I was talking about earlier, about sort of saying, yeah, all that stuff that postmodernism told us about how we're embedded radically within cultures and the biggest thing we have to fear is cultural homogenization, all that's understandable. But actually, isn't moving toward a greater form of universalism good? This is not what I'm saying. This is what I'm saying I see critics and artists and writers saying over the last 20 years. Her praising Ishiguro for doing something that I think a postmodernist might consider, homogenizing his own work, making a book that can be easily read in English, in Japanese, in French, in German, in Chinese, in Arabic. Isn't that homogenizing your own work? And he's saying, no, I'm trying to be universal. Isn't that what we should strive to be in this globalized world? And so, and I think it's interesting that, one of the strangest things over the last 20 years, I think, is that, when I was a teenager, anti-globalization was the left-wing position, and pro-globalization was the right-wing one, and now it's flipped. Now it's, so in the 90s, the anti-globalization protesters were leftists. They were anarchists. They look up the Battle of Seattle. Google that if you want to know. And now anti-globalization is the right-wing position. That's the banner of Donald Trump's movement, for instance. And I think this essay, though it seems to be about something very far from these big picture political arguments, is, I think, an interesting moment in 2007 where you have a writer who I can only assume is somewhere politically on the left saying, cultural homogenization, I guess that's something to worry about, but actually universalism is a good thing, and it's something we should strive for, and globalization is a good thing and something we can strive for. So that's just interesting. Maybe this is too much of a digression. I don't know. It's hard to say. There's nobody here. I'm alone in the room. There's nobody here to tell me. If we were in person, you could tell me to shut up, but you're not. So you could always hit dislike on the video, I guess. But no, don't do that. Smash that like button, as they say. Anyway, digression over. Valeria Luiselli's book, I think, will be interesting in the way that it deals with this issue. I think Luiselli's book is very worried in some ways about cultural homogenization and is very clear about the inequalities in global translation. But also, I think it's a book that has a universalist aspiration. It's a book that, for instance, as we'll see, tries to argue, I think, that United States literature and Mexican literature, maybe more broadly North American literature and Latin American literature, should really be thought of as one literature. So I think Luiselli I think she's neo-modernist. I think she's meta-modernist. I think she wants to achieve a kind of universal literary republic, if you will. But I think she's also deeply aware of the homogenizing forces that would leave the Republic of Letters, so-called, simply in the hands of the dominant European and American powers. So that's why I think we need to understand this issue of world literature before we can understand the things her book is worried about when it talks about the travails, because you probably haven't read it yet. The main character is a translator, and she's a translator from Mexico living in the United States, trying to convince her American publisher that a certain Mexican poet is worth translating. And she's running into these issues about, homogenization, pluralism versus universalism. So I think, just like the image we saw on the first slide of the person chained but trying to reach the ladder and go into the sky, Luiselli is aware of the constraints under which she's operating, even as she aspires toward universalism. And that's neo-modernist, that's meta-modernist, as opposed to the postmodernist position, which just says the aspiration is ultimately too dangerous. You're just going to create a new and exclusive form of universalism, so we must just rest within cultural relativism and cultural plurality. All right, so that's my discussion of world literature. Now I think we need to say a few words about translation itself, because while we have been reading works from the very beginning of the semester that I think have been somehow international, as I explained, we've entirely read works written originally in English, with the exception of Ezra Pound, who I think Ezra Pound wasn't translating, he was adapting what he thought Chinese and Japanese poetry was like. But all the works we've read so far were originally written in English. With Luiselli, we are reading a work originally written in another language, Spanish, and translated into English. So we're reading a translated work. And Luiselli has written 2 novels in Spanish and 1 novel in English. So she writes originally both in Spanish and in English. I'll get into her biography in a minute, but she has been an international person throughout her life. She's lived in multiple countries. She was born in Mexico. Her parents are Mexican, but she's lived most of her adult life, it seems, in the U.S. So we have a multilingual, bilingual text. So we need to, and not only that, but it's an autobiographical novel, so the narrator is a translator. So we need to think about what translation is. So I have a slide here that's about theories of translation. I actually borrowed this slide from one time I taught this class, and one of the TAs did a guest lecture on this topic. Her name is Kate Ferraro. I don't think she works at the University of Minnesota anymore, but I just borrowed this excellent slide from her and put it into my own slide, where she laid out 3 different ways you can take a text in one language and render it into another language. The first one is a one-to-one translation or literal translation. This treats language like a code and assumes that each word has an exact match in another language. And this is how Google Translate broadly works. Now, the problem with one-to-one or literal translation is that each word in some sense might have an equivalent in another language, though this is not actually true. We talked about the German word Bildung. There's no one English word that captures all the shades of meaning of Bildung. So it's not actually true that every word has an exact equivalence, between two languages. But also, words are not always the basic building block of meaning. Sometimes whole phrases are the building blocks of meaning. And so if you translate a text word for word, you might get a word for word translation that misses the meaning because you've misunderstood that one phrase is an idiom, that is a kind of metaphor that doesn't mean what it literally means. So just think of let's just try to think of an English idiom. I should have prepared for this, that you couldn't translate word for word. Let me think. I'm trying to think of one. Hold on. See, now that I'm trying to think of one, it's not coming to me. But I'm sure you can think of a phrase that doesn't mean what it literally means. Here's a grotesque one. I don't know, people don't say this anymore, but I feel like people said this when I was a kid. There's more than one way to skin a cat. That's a horrible thing to say. Why would you want to skin a cat? But if you translated that word for word, you would just get a gruesome phrase in another language. You would just get, there's more than one way to skin a cat in another language. What a terrible thing to say. But what it means is there's more than one way to do something, to do anything. And so you would translate word for word, but you wouldn't get the real metaphorical meaning of the phrase. So that's one extreme, a literal word for word translation. The next extreme is adaptation, where you say the content of the text is more important than the actual words, so you translate the meaning without translating word for word. And this is what Ezra Pound would do in his Chinese and Japanese and his European, Provençal, etc. translations. He would take the basic meaning and make his own poem out of it. So that's adaptation. It's not really trying to be a faithful translation at all. It's trying to be a new rendition of the meaning. And then finally, you have traditional translation, which tries to find a middle ground between preserving the basic idea and capturing the original language. Most literary translations are traditional. So Christine McSweeney's translation of Louis Selly's novel Faces in the Crowd is a traditional translation. She doesn't go word for word. She knows she has to capture the meaning more than the individual words, but she also doesn't just create kind of a free adaptation. The last poem I want to look at in this class is an example of a free adaptation. It's called Love of My Flesh, Living Death, and I use it to show you kind of how extreme adaptation can be. So Lorna de Cervantes is a contemporary American poet. She was born in 1954. She's a Chicana poet and activist born in San Francisco and educated at San Jose State University and UC Santa Cruz, and she's of Mexican and Native American ancestry. And this poem of hers is an adaptation of a poem by a Spanish poet named Federico Garcia Lorca. He lived from 1898 to 1936. He appears, by the way, also in Faces in the Crowd by Valeria Luiselli. She doesn't miss anything. He was a Spanish poet and playwright who spent a lot of time in the United States. He wrote one of his most famous books is called Poet in New York. And he was a member of the Generation of 27 group of writers who brought modernism to Spanish literature. He was unfortunately murdered by fascists during the Spanish Civil War because he was a leftist. He was also gay, and the fascists were anti-leftist. They were very culturally conservative, and so he was murdered as a kind of enemy to their movement during the war between the the fascist movement of General Francisco Franco and the Republican forces supporting the left in the Spanish Civil War. So he unfortunately had a terrible fate as a kind of political martyr. And he was translated into English. He was first translated by a lot of modernist poets, particularly Langston Hughes and William Carlos Williams were very interested in his poetry and in translating it. And he was most associated with a kind of theory of poetry called duende, Duende, duende. And this is a word that does not have an exact English equivalent. It means a kind of spontaneous intensity, a kind of spontaneous vitality, often drawn from popular or folk sources that he celebrated in his poetry. And so his poetry is often sort of committed to achieving this intensity. And so he writes a poem called "The Poet Begs His Love for a Letter." I'm just going to read it. Love is this living death, and love's the knife that twists my innards. I wait for one word and wonder if this bloom can last the drought, if losing you would gain me back my life. The air is everlasting, and the stone knows neither light nor shade nor where it's thrown. The heart at home has no hunger nor need for the frozen honey which the moon pours out. But I feed my heart to a double beast, raked by a tiger and pecked by a dove, a duel between the cactus and the lily. Send me a word, then, to fill up that wound, or let me live in peace and without love and find an orbit in dark space alone. Now, needless to say, this isn't his original. His original was written in Spanish, but I pulled from a website a traditional translation. This is a translation that tries to capture his basic meaning in much of his language. And as you can see, we don't have time, so I'm not gonna go on and on about the meaning of the poem. You can see he uses a lot of rich and somewhat suggestive rather than literally clear imagery. The air is everlasting, the stone neither light nor shade, the duel between the cactus and the lily. So he uses a lot of this, I think what a later poet called deep imagery, this attempt to use imagery out of the unconscious to suggest this emotional experience. And Lorna de Cervantes writes a contemporary English language poem which she describes as being after Lorca. So not a translation from Lorca, but a kind of successor poem that borrows his imagery, borrows his intensity, but doesn't give you a word-for-word translation. And her poem is even more, I would say, interestingly inexplicable in its imagery. So she writes, "Once I wasn't always so plain. I was strewn feathers on a cross of dune, an expanse of ocean at my feet, garlands of gulls, sirens and gulls. They couldn't tame you. You know as well as they. To be a dove is to bear the falcon at your breast, your nights, your seas. My fear is simple, heart-faced above a flare of etchings, a lineage in letters, my sudden stare. It's you. It's you, sang the heart upon its mantle pelvis. Blush of my breath, catch of my sea, beautiful bird, it's you." So what that all means, I'm not quite sure. You should write a paper about it. It would be interesting. But the important thing is she takes some of his basic themes of love and death, and she takes his interest in this kind of pregnant, deep imagery and writes her own poem. So this is an adaptation. This is not a translation. But adaptation is on a continuum of different ways you can carry one text from one language into another. You can go word for word, but you'll miss some of the meaning. You can try to capture the overall meaning, which is what most translators try to do, or you could create your own freestanding work of art based on themes, motifs, and significance from the prior work, but not wedded to its language. And while we're reading a translation of a novel originally written in Spanish that I think tries to be a traditional translation, these different ideas of how translation should be come up in the novel and are part of its themes. All right, just a few more things I'd like to say. Just briefly, the biography of our author, Valeria Luiselli. She was born in 1983, which makes her the only author in the course younger than me. She's only younger by a year, but I still find it a little bit depressing. But she was born in 1983 in Mexico City, and her father was a diplomat. So she grew up all over the world. She grew up in Costa Rica, South Korea, South Africa, and elsewhere. And she currently lives in New York City. I say with her husband, though, based on her last autobiographical novel. It should be her ex-husband, another Mexican writer who's pretty famous called Alvaro Enrique, and she writes and teaches in New York. I think she still does live in New York, even if it's not with Alvaro. But so that's her. That's Valeria Luiselli. She's a younger author, so we don't, there's not been a biography written about her or anything, so that's what we know about her. But the interesting thing is the international background and the multilingual background. I think she, as I said, she wrote, so Faces in the Crowd is her first novel. It was written in Spanish and first published in Mexico, and then quickly translated into English and published in the United States by a small press, because she was kind of an unknown experimental author. However, that book and some of her other early works became famous enough that her most recent novel, Lost Children Archive, was published by a major American publisher and first written in English. And that's an excellent novel, by the way, Lost Children Archive. It's big, though. It's about 400 or 500 pages. It's a so if Faces in the Crowd was her modest first novel, Lost Children Archive is her ambitious attempt to write a magnum opus, and it's excellent. But it's too long for this class, so we'll stick with the more modest first novel, unfortunately, or not unfortunately. Faces in the Crowd is great, but Lost Children Archive is on a much grander scale as a work of fiction. So I recommend checking it out. But that's Valeria Luiselli. I'm not trying to give you a bad example, but the character in the book smokes a lot, and so Valeria Luiselli also seems to smoke a lot, so I thought it would just be characteristic. But don't smoke. It's not good. It's not cool. It's not good for you. So that's Valeria Luiselli. And then the last thing I want to say, I'm going to come back to this slide. This will be the first slide of the next lecture. I want to say one more thing before ending this lecture, which is there's one more concept from our modernism unit that we need to remember in reading Faces in the Crowd, which is an idea I introduced to you in discussing Quicksand, that of the flaneur, or the female variant, the flaneuse. And you'll remember the flaneur or flaneuse was one who strolls in the modern city amid the diverse crowd, observing as a detached and disinterested spectator. And again, this was originally conceived as a male archetype by the French poet Charles Baudelaire in his essay The Painter of Modern Life. But from modernism forward, there's been a lot of interest in the female example, the flaneuse. And we said that Helga Crane was kind of an attempted flaneuse, but the inequalities in her time of race and gender meant that she had a lot of trouble being a flaneuse, that this still seemed to be an ideal reserved for white men. And I put the big quotation from Baudelaire defining what the flaneur is here, just in case you're interested. I'm not going to read through it. But there's been a lot of renewed interest in the flaneur and the flaneuse, along with the neo-modernist novels I was talking about, autobiographical, plotless novels. And how do you structure an autobiographical, plotless novel? You structure it according to your wanderings through the modern world. And so there's been a lot of novels of neo-flaneurie, of people flaneuring about the city. And I think that Faces in the Crowd does this. Faces in the Crowd has two characters, really, who make it their business to wander the city. So we need to return to this idea of the flaneur, the flaneuse, and its possibilities in our century, even as it was born in the 19th century and sort of canonized in modernism. So with all that, with all those things I said, many things I've said, I think you're now ready to read Faces in the Crowd. So I would say please do read Faces in the Crowd, read the whole thing, and then my next lecture will be about the text as a whole. I will talk about passages from the text. I will talk about the overall structure And it is an experimental novel, maybe the most experimental novel I've asked you to read this semester. But it's also very short. I think even if you don't like it, you'll be finished reading it before you're even tired of it. So that's that. Please read Faces in the Crowd. The next and final lecture on course content will be my lecture on Faces in the Crowd. In the meantime, thanks for your attention and have a great day.